Logan, are you listening? By default, that means the Bible is where we get our authority. The next question someone might ask you is, okay, like when we talk about is there a God or is there even a God, right? We can look at the world around us, right? And we can look at the way people are designed. And if someone says, is there a God? There's things we could say, right? We could speak to the world around us, how everything was created. And then we can also speak to the creation of man, right? And we have found other planets outside of our solar system, but none of them come close to a planet like the Earth. So we're very special. People thought there'd be a lot of planets like our Earth, and there's not. And so the point is, the more they find, the less they see there anything like the Earth. And so, so that part we get. But then you're like, well, there's all these people that claim God. So how do we argue for the Christian God, the God of the Bible, right? And so I think what's important to realize is, and then some people will say, you know what, I think there's something out there, but who knows if it's a God, if it's personal, right? And so one of the things that you can reflect on is, because remember, when people don't believe in God, they think they're the source of everything, right? So they think love exists because I exist. So I mean, as long as I'm aware of it and I'm thinking about it, it has its origin in my mind.
Gianna.
So they base everything off themselves, right? And in the Bible,
Sit down, please.
in the Bible, we're told that in John, in the Gospel of John, we're told. Remember when Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," right? No one comes to the Father but through me. God is truth, and so really, that's the key, because when you're talking to someone about God, like to say that God is personal, you have to work your way down to the Christian God, right? But you could start off by looking at creation to say that there is a God. But the three things that are outside of man is the laws of nature, because God created this world with order, right? There's the moral law, and that's not, people think, people make morals, but look at people around this world. Everyone knows that killing is wrong. Everyone knows that lying is wrong. Everyone inherently knows the 10 Commandments to some degree or another. So we know that the moral law was given by God, and that exists. And so someone says, well, people make that up. And it's like, you know what? When that person dies, love still exists. So those concepts aren't man-made because they extend beyond people, right? And then the laws of logic, right? The laws of logic are a few things, but that's where we get language. And God is the source of logic also. Logic is not something outside of God. It's a reflection of God. And the first rule of the law of logic is the law of non-contradiction, right? That means if something is A and something is B, or you can't have something be A and non-A at the same time. So this is a pen. It cannot be a pen and a pen at the same time, right? That's a contradiction. To say this is a pen, but it's not a pen.
It can't be a...
But that's called lying, right? It's not telling the truth. And so that's what establishes the laws of logic. God says.
But that's not a bad law.
God says in Numbers, in the book of Numbers, it says God says in the book of Numbers that I am not like man that I lie. Right? God is not like man that lies.
Mm-hmm.
So that means God always tells the truth. And the very fact that God is truth means he's the source of logic. And without logic, we wouldn't have language. Because I would say words, and then you can assign up the opposite meaning to them, right? So we all speak logically. So God used logic, which is a reflection of his character, to create language, to make it a means by which he can communicate himself to us. So you notice, if people say, well, logic was invented by people, when someone dies, people still use logic, right? Logic,
if all the humans died, then animals.
Logic is still logic, right?
Animals would still.
The laws of nature are still the laws of nature. The moral laws are still the moral laws. So these things transcend people. And as soon as you get people to think outside of themselves, they have to think about a God because these things came from somewhere. Nothing can't make something. It never has and never will. That's a contradiction, right? So
What? What do you?
Nothing-
Can't make
something can't come from nothing. So we have three things right there: the laws of nature, the moral law, the laws of logic. These things that reflect not only God's act of creation, but the other two reflect His character. These things have their
So
origin.
that's why the Big Bang Theory is like, because.
No, it has nothing to do with that. What has to do with that? What has to do with is people. If they don't have God, they have to come up. They have to have a source for these things. And you can't. If someone says, "I'm not going to believe something unless I can put it in my hand," I don't believe in God because He doesn't show Himself to me. And if they're that empirical, you can say, "Okay, put the laws of logic in a jar. Put love in a jar." Does that make sense that you have to hold it to believe in it? There's a lot of things we believe in that we do not see, right? And so it's not illogical to believe in God. So I'm just giving you a basis to realize that the very fabric that makes up this whole world, beyond what we see, and the things that we love and care for, and the things that we understand to be right and wrong, and the things of language and how people communicate, which is the source of logic, right? Where language comes from. It all has its root in God. So that's why we presuppose God, because someone who says, "I'm going to come to the table and I'm my own God and I want to start with a clean slate." You already have language, you're presupposing logic, you're presupposing the laws of nature, you're presupposing morality. You're coming to the table with all these things, and we're like, where did those things come from? And they don't have a source. So that was just for reflection today to say, I just want to occasionally add this because these will come into conversations with you at school. When someone even asks why there is a God, is they're not thinking beyond themselves and realizing that, because if it's all in their mind, then when they die, it should all go away. But it doesn't. Things still exist. So it can't be bound by the human mind because they're still here long after people die. So these things exist. And so if it exists, something created it. Something gave it order. So how did it get here, right? And so these, I hope some of these will help you frame the argument. And then later on, tomorrow we probably won't do it, but as we move on through some of these things, we're going to talk. I just want to paint a picture of what our authority is, how God, why there is a God, and He's personal because He's all these things. And then we can tailor this more into a discussion as to, well, why our God and not Allah? You know, why our God and not the Mormon God? What gives our God authority? And we won't go into that today, but to give you a hint into that is, since the world and history is governed by God, the testimony of God will be consistent with history. So the Book of Mormon has historical errors. Allah, and the Quran has historical errors in the book. The Bible doesn't have any historical errors. And they contradict themselves. So we would say, if God was in these other religions, we would see consistency with history. And if you see a lack of consistency or a contradiction or saying claims that aren't true, then you're like, well, that rules that out.
Well, but is there books that, like other books that tell of the beginning of the world that are like Bibles or like?
Yeah.
Well.
But they don't say it was created out of nothing. They say that there was. No. They say something like there was spirits, a turtle, something. You know, really, that the world is held up by a turtle. There's these.
That theory.
There's these mythological things, but there's never.
But ever since the first.
Not any one of them say that the universe was created out of nothing. Christianity is the only one that says that this world. And guess what? The laws of physics all point to the fact that everything had a beginning, and that's blown everyone away. Up until the 1800s, everyone thought. Well, people could argue that the universe has always existed forever, and we just showed up, you know. But everything here in the universe has always been around forever. But after the 1800s, we found out, no, it had a beginning.
It's expanding, so there must have
been a beginning. And once they found that out, they're like, oh man, everything, even time, we're talking about time, it changes too. They thought time was flat. It's a same time for everyone. It's like, no, time's even moldable like clay. Depends on where you're at and how fast you're going.
Yeah.
And so once you find that out, you're like, well, time itself had a beginning. So that sets the clock back for everything because everything is governed by time. So now that means there's a point in history when nothing was here. And scientists are struggling with that because they're like, well, that means something must have created it. That's the first instinct. Well, they don't like that because that's saying that there's a God. So they have to think, well, we're getting something wrong, but we're not.
But what about but there was all the other religions came after Christianity. Christianity was like the first religion, right?
Technically the first one, but yeah, you're right. It was the first one because God created Adam and Eve. Yes.
Well,